As we all know, when it comes to the horror genre, there's no short supply of sequels. This dates back to the classic Universal monster movies of the 30s and 40s. It's no secret that sequels are a direct result of a film's success, and that movie studios see them as a way to further cash in on that success, making their one movie into a franchise. I'll be the first to admit I get suckered into movie sequels all the time. But when it comes to horror, what we generally get is a copycat. Think about it. Most slasher sequels barely qualify as sequels because aside from the villain, the cast is always new. After all, the original cast is usually killed off in the prior film, and if there is a survivor, they're generally the first to go in the next one. Not only that, but most horror sequels copy the exact same paint-by-the-number formula. It's a body count. No matter how intuitive they might get, it's just an axe murderer going on a slaughter spree. By definition, Scream 2 is a typical horror sequel that follows all the conventions. But like its predecessor, it knows what it is, and rather than succumb to a bunch of smart-ass movie critics, it blatantly tells us, hey, I'm a slasher sequel. You know what to expect, you paid your money, and you enjoyed the fucking ride. In Scream 2, Hollywood has cashed in on Sidney Prescott's story by producing its own movie called Stab. It might be good to note that for the rest of the series, Stab becomes its own franchise, used as a plot device for the movies to poke fun at themselves. During a screening of Stab, where Heather Graham plays the on-screen Casey, 2 Windsor College students are killed, Omar Epps as Phil and Jada Pinkett Smith as Maureen, who gets her glorious death in front of an oblivious audience. Of course, the media is all over the story, bringing avaricious Gail Weathers back to the scene. Fresh off her book The Woodsboro Murders, Gail continues to be a thorn in everyone's side, especially Dewey's, who doesn't exactly agree with how she portrayed him.
How do you know that my dim-witted inexperience isn't merely a subtle form of manipulation used to lower people's expectations, thereby enhancing my ability to effectively maneuver within any given situation?
After the initial opening sequence, it starts with Sidney getting a prank phone call from the familiar voice, who we now know as Ghostface.
Corey Gillis, 555-0176.
Shit!
Hot flash, Corey. Prank calls are a criminal offense prosecuted under Penal Code 653M. Hope you enjoyed the movie.
As it turns out, Sidney's been expecting random phone calls because, hey, it's opening weekend for the movie. But when she turns on the news and sees that 2 kids from her college were actually sliced to pieces, she starts to panic and goes to find Randy, who's taking film classes at the same college. Sidney thinks that the murders are about to start up again, while Randy is pretty much in denial about the whole thing, claiming that it was just a coincidence. However, it begs that age-old question of whether or not movies are responsible for raising psychopaths.
Life is life. It doesn't imitate anything.
Come on, Randy. With all due respect, the killer obviously patterned himself after 2 serial killers who have been immortalized on film.
Of course, they also have to have the familiar sequel debate.
No, Aliens is a classic, okay? Get away from her, you bitch.
I believe the line is stay away from me, you bitch. It's film class, right?
One fine example of how this movie knows exactly what it is and doesn't make excuses for it. By the way, Godfather 2 is not better than Godfather 1. After another murder, this one being Sarah Michelle Gellar as an airhead frat sister, Sidney is finally attacked by the killer with her new boyfriend Derek, played by Jerry O'Connell, getting the sharp end of the knife and making him the prime suspect. Sidney starts to doubt Derek because her last relationship didn't work out too well, while Gail and Dewey partner with the police to see if there's a pattern. Cotton Weary, the guy who was originally accused of killing Sidney's mom, has since been released from jail after being found innocent, and now follows Gail around in hopes of getting a 15-minute interview with Sidney.
You'll get your 10 minutes when I get my goddamn interview.
This doesn't go as well as he'd like, and so he makes a scene in the middle of a library, making him another suspect.
Lovable and fucked up Sidney Prescott, everybody's favorite little victim. Wow.
Cotton is a great character because we don't exactly trust him given his background. His approaching Sidney the way he does enhances that distrust, but at the same time, we sympathize with him. He's an innocent man who just wants to set the record straight, and get rich while doing it. It's unclear what his intentions are, but we get a pretty good picture of him by the end of the movie. Then there's the scene where the killer phones Sidney on the campus grounds.
I'm not interrupting anything, am I?
Having Dewey, Randy, and Gail search everyone's cell phones. It's a pretty intense scene, made a little lighter by Randy's taunts.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Showgirls. Absolutely
Frightening.
But then something happens. Randy gets killed. If this were any other horror movie, chances are I wouldn't care. It's a horror movie, and by definition, people live, people die. Mostly, they die. But after the original Scream, people actually liked Randy. He wasn't just the typical token goofball who makes a few corny jokes and then gets a knife in the back. His witty tirades about horror movies, his development of the rules to surviving one, and his outgoing personality worked in his favor. When Randy was killed, this was actually kind of upsetting, especially since, up to this point, we assume he's a virgin. The virgin has to live, right? So anyway, during another attempt on Sydney's life, the police decide it's best that she be escorted off campus. Ghostface somehow catches up with them, with Sydney, of course, being the only survivor. The end finale takes place in Sydney's theater class. I won't spoil anything, but when the killers are revealed, it's pretty disappointing. I only say this because when you look back at the first movie, the killers were people who had a decent amount of screen time. They were likable, but when it came time for them to reveal themselves, it was also believable. The killers in this one really don't have that much screen time, so it's a little more abrupt and not as interesting. One of the killers is pretty random and has a lame motive, while the other one at least plays a part in Sydney's past. Overall, Scream 2 delivers everything you'd expect from a slasher sequel, but it manages to stay fresh. It isn't quite as effective as the original, only because it isn't establishing anything new. It's pretty routine. We get a mysterious phone call and then someone gets killed. It's a paint-by-the-number slasher, sure, but one with a little style. The characters are just as fun as they were in the original, and we end up caring for most of them, which is more than what I can say for most horror movies. It continues the story, which also doesn't happen too often in this genre. As I said from the beginning, usually all the characters are killed, and then when we get to the inevitable sequel, we start off with a brand new cast of generic pigs for slaughter. Scream is like watching a soap opera, and while we come back to see who gets killed next, we also come back for the continuing story revolving around Sid and her friends. And I have to say, for a horror series, that's near unheard of.